Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Jack Knott. I'm the Dean of the Saul Price School of Public Policy at USC. And I'd like to welcome all of you to this special Judge Widney Distinguished Lecture featuring Leonard Schaefer. But before I begin, I just want to take one moment and acknowledge Heidi Rosano, who is the person who is responsible for putting this lunch together and all the logistics of it. So could we give a little round of applause, and thank you, Heidi. So today's distinguished lecture, which is titled Leaders, Managers, or Analysts, Who Will Shape the Future?, focuses on the critical topic of leadership, which is a signature part of our school. We were one of the first schools in the country to develop and offer an Executive Masters of Leadership program. But more broadly, we seek to educate our students and prepare them to be future leaders in the public sector and in the nonprofit sector, as well as in the private sector and business. And there are a few people who actually provide great leadership across all three of those sectors. And one is the namesake for our school, Saul Price. He was obviously a great leader in the retail industry. He founded Price Charities and had an impact on revitalizing urban, low-income urban neighborhoods. And he also was very active in federal policy, working with the Urban Institute, for example, in Washington, D.C. But as you will come to learn, our speaker today, likewise, has been a great leader across all three sectors in very different roles that require different leadership abilities and strategies. Leonard Schaefer is the founding chairman and former CEO of WellPoint, which is the nation's largest health benefits company with about 33 million members and an annual revenue of about $58 billion. And he served as chairman until 2005. And currently, we're very proud because he's the Judge Robert McClay Widney Chair and Professor at USC, as well as Senior Advisor to TPG Capital, a private equity firm. And for those of you who do not know who Judge Widney is, he was the founder of USC and the first chair of the Board of Governors of USC over 130 years ago. So when Leonard was originally recruited to be the CEO of WellPoint's predecessor, the nonprofit Blue Cross of California, back in 1986, the company was near bankruptcy. He successfully managed its turnaround and eventually its IPO, which occurred in 1993. And so during his tenure as CEO of WellPoint, 17 acquisitions were made, and the value ballooned from $11 million to $49 billion under his leadership. In the process also of converting the nonprofit Blue Cross of California to the for-profit WellPoint, Leonard was very instrumental in creating one of the nation's largest foundations, the California Endowment. And both he and WellPoint have gained widespread acclaim. Fortune magazine named it one of America's most admired healthcare companies for 6 years in a row. And Leonard himself was recognized as one of the top executives in the nation by both Business Week and Worth magazine. Leonard also has great experience in the public sector, having served as the administrator of Medicare and Medicaid in what was then the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, as well as Assistant Secretary for Management and Budget in that department. And going back to where I came from in Illinois, he was the director of the Office of Management and Budget in the state of Illinois prior to that. In addition to all these accomplishments, one of the things that we're obviously most proud of is that he's been a committed supporter of the USC Price School for many years. He serves on the school's board of counselors and provides advice to me and the school. And in 2009, he was critical in helping us establish a new research center, the Leonard Schaefer Center for Health Policy and Economics. And this center is a collaboration between the USC School of Pharmacy and the Price School, and it emphasizes an interdisciplinary, really special approach to research and analysis to promote health efficiency and value in healthcare delivery and evidence-based healthcare. And I just want to acknowledge Dean Pete Vanderveen, who's my co-conspirator with Leonard in this center. He's been a great colleague and friend. And we have Dana Goldman here also, who is the director of the center, and we're very pleased to have him join us today as well. Yeah, let's give Dana a round of applause as well. Leonard also now serves as the chair of the Board of Advisors to the Leonard Schaefer Center. And in a very short period of time, the center has attracted some remarkable faculty and has become one of the top research institutes in that field. And I can't help but pointing out that in the latest U.S. News and World Report rankings of our school, we moved up 5 points from number 9 to number 4 in the area of health policy and management. And of course, we have an excellent director of our graduate programs, Mike Nickel, who's done a great job. And I have to say also the Schaefer Center and the great work they do and the tremendous contribution they've made to our reputation is really incredibly important for this movement and our reputation as a school as well. So for a whole number of reasons, it is my great pleasure to ask you to join me in welcoming Leonard Schaefer.
Today, I'm going to briefly discuss 5 topics, and let's see if we can make this work. Not a chance. There you go. Okay. So by way of introduction, I'm going to explain why I'm here. Then I'm going to focus on how institutions change and how they respond to external changes. And this will lead to a discussion of the actors inside institutions who can foster and frustrate change and the challenges that they face. Finally, I will end with a big finish. Actually not. I will end with a very small finish, but hopefully will lead to some discussion we can all have about some of the issues that I've talked about. When I first became affiliated with USC, I am the Judge Widney professor, and for those of you on an academic track, this is going to be kind of disheartening. It turns out that every other professor on this campus actually had to achieve some prominence in an academic endeavor, and in order to be named a professor, the colleagues in that in whatever department you're in have to evaluate your work and decide whether you're up to snuff. The Judge Widney professorship is filled by act of God. That is to say, the president of the university says, "You are it." And so this was offered to me, and I was quite overwhelmed, and I accepted on my mother's behalf, who always thought I had wasted my life. So now I'm a professor and proud of it. Anyhow, when I first got the professorship, I was asked to address a group of the faculty, and I put together what I thought was a pretty good presentation that was filled with statistics and facts and charts and to show off an awful lot of footnotes, and that's not what we're going to have today. Okay, sorry, sports fans. What we're going to talk about today is what has grown out of a seminar that I teach for graduate students about leadership and management in healthcare. And Jack asked me to extend some of the observations that are in that course and some of the experiences that are discussed in that class to the national, international scene. I'm going to try to do that. So you're all sitting there in an academic institution saying, on what basis, if not detailed research, can this guy claim to have insights about leadership and management? And the answer is, I've been around the block, okay? So I've had lots of opportunities in these roles, and by the way, this is why I took the professorship. I was once introduced very kindly by a gentleman who went through all of the things I have done. My mother was in the audience, and in the voice that only mothers can use, she turned to my father and said, "That's my Leonard. He just can't keep a job." That's a true story. The President of the United States was in the audience. It was just great. Anyhow, so I've been a lot of places and done a lot of things, and they range from government to industry or the private sector, from for-profit to not-for-profit. And this talk is based on my observations of other people in those organizations, the reading and the casework and the seminar, and a lot of arguments I've had with a lot of people about leadership and management. So let's begin, though, by talking about institutions and how they respond to change. And the fact is, at least in my experience, they don't do it very well. Large institutions actively resist change. Most labor-intensive organizations institutionalize a way of doing things, and then that's what they do. They resist changes to that process. Now, there's some logic, because this is how we got to be successful, and if we're going to be more successful, we want to do it again or do it harder. The best example is Henry Ford. I mean, he invented the assembly line, and the key thing about getting cars built timely and effectively is to do it the same way every time. And most institutions have a preferred way of doing it. It is called our way of doing things, and it is distributed and imposed through procedures and guidelines and through culture. Most organizations repeat past, hopefully successful behaviors until they die or are reinvented. And unfortunately, most organizations die. The classic are diminished over time. They don't all go out of existence. But there are many examples in our country. The railroads would be a great example. My favorite example is a story about General Motors. And I'm hoping that most of you are old enough to remember there was a car called the Oldsmobile, which was the doctor's car. It was between the Buick and the Cadillac. And it was, if you were rich but didn't want to show off, you drove an Oldsmobile. So there's a famous story about the Oldsmobile top management going off-site, and because they were having some trouble selling their cars, and spending whatever it was, a couple of days, figuring out their strategy for the comeback. And they figured it out, and they came back, and they presented it to the CEO of General Motors, and went through all of the things they're going to do, and at the end, with great flourish, said, and as a result, our market share will decline by 9%. And the question was, well, what's the point of this if you're going to lose market share? And the answer was, well, it's not our fault. It's the customers just don't want to buy Oldsmobiles. Okay, the point of the story is we're doing what made us successful over time. People used to like what we were building, and so we're going to build the same thing. And during that period of time, the Japanese cars just took over, and now Oldsmobile is no longer manufactured. So that's what most organizations do. Now, the problem with that is the only constant is change. If you look around, look out the window or look around this room, all things are changing all the time. Science and technology, obviously. Demographics are changing, huge impact in our country. Cultural changes, amazing. Some of us have suits and ties, most of us don't. There was a time when you couldn't get in this room if you weren't wearing a suit and tie. The economy is undergoing great change. Our political process, our political system, public policy, not just in terms of what legislatures and elected officials do, but in terms of what the court system does and what we expect of the public process. So to survive and prosper, organizations, institutions have to reinvent themselves in a manner that's not only not the way they always did it, but in a way that's consistent with the changing environment. Now, that's hard to do, and one of the reasons has to do with efficiency. I don't think there are any completely efficient human interactions. I am told there are actually chemical, interactions that are efficient, but most human systems are inherently inefficient. And the larger the organization, the more inefficient it is, and the more insensitive to external changes. And there are two sort of things that are going on here. The first, in terms of efficiency, remember that game that kids play, or maybe you have seen people play, where you sit people down in chairs, and you start with a phrase, and the first person whispers to the second person, to the third person, to the fourth, and by the time you get to the end, it's gibberish, okay? That's what happens in large, labor-intensive organizations. It's very difficult to communicate efficiently. The other thing that tends to happen is you look inward. Remember, we had this way of doing things and it worked. We sold all of these great Ford automobiles, and so we got to make sure that we continue to do that right. We don't look at the outside world where people are saying, yeah, they like Ford cars, but they would like to have a red Ford car, not a black Ford car. Well, we make only black Ford cars, and it doesn't matter what they're saying. We got to make sure we're doing our things right. Now, in today's world, that's called being in the bubble. And you see that in Washington, where if you were to go to talk to your elected officials or to watch a debate in Congress, you would be stunned by what people say is happening in America when they actually live in Washington. They don't know, okay? And they deal with each other, and they deal with staff and with lobbyists, and they are in the bubble, not in America. It happens in large organizations. I hesitate to say it happens even in educational institutions. And it's one of the reasons that change agents are so important. You've got to have people, or you've got to have agents that help organizations move off the dime, even with the problem of inefficiency and even with the problem of internalization. So success over time requires effective change as the outside world is changing, and as a result, the future belongs to those organizations, those institutions where leaders stimulate change that's consistent with or benefits from the environmental change, and managers implement. Now, I'm sure people will want to debate that, but I got the podium, and I'm going to keep talking until I'm done, and then we will discuss it. The issue that I'm sure is on all of your minds is there are an awful lot of people in institutions or organizations who aren't leaders or managers, and they have a big impact as well. So let's look at that, okay? And we will talk about a typology of leadership. This is based on my experience. There is no empirical evidence, but as I've said, I've been around, and I think this is a pretty good way at looking at human institutions. We start with individual contributors, and this is presented as if it's a hierarchy. It's not. Just a way of looking at things. So in most institutions, you have individual contributors. There are occasionally people who are also conceptualizers. There are usually a lot of analysts. I'm going to come back to this because analysis is a very, very important function, and those of you who are students are being trained to do this well. There's a huge difference, though, between performing an analysis and having something happen as a result. I want to spend some time on that. Most of the people who are in the management ranks are administrators, and we'll talk about that. And then there are rarely leaders, and more rarely still, symbolic leaders. So let's talk about individual contributors. Most people in large organizations are people who do their own work. Okay, that's what large organizations are about. There's a particular subset of individual contributors who are very important, and they make change very difficult. And these are often people who are highly educated professionals. They're independent, and they identify with their profession as opposed to the organization or the system for getting things done. Doctors are a very good example, and when I teach this other course, we talk a lot about how doctors identify with their profession, not with the organization, not with the institution. You'll find lawyers do a very similar thing, and I hesitate to say this out loud in front of this august group, but professors are a classic example of this. These are people whose major focus is on maximizing their own discretion. I'm a professional. As a physician, I've been trained for 24 years, and I know what I'm doing. So I want to be left alone to do that thing, and that thing is, in my judgment, what's best for my patient, or if you're a lawyer, my client, or if you're a professor for my research. Okay? The result is these people tend to degrade the organization or system effectiveness, not purposefully, but that's what tends to happen. And they would prefer to have personal effectiveness as opposed to institutional effectiveness, okay? And again, not purposefully, but that's the outcome of it. And because their goal is the impact on one patient or one client, or in the professor's case, getting one book done and winning the Nobel. Now, that's a subset. Most individual, and that was a throwaway just for this group. Most individual contributors in most organizations are just regular folks doing their jobs. You know, gardeners, clerks. I mean, look around the world. Most people are individual contributors, and hopefully most are doing a good job. There's another type of person in a large organization that I call a conceptualizer, who generates or communicates ideas that influence the behavior of other people. This is very important, and it's different from influencing people through your own behavior. We'll talk about that in a minute. These are people whose ideas influence other folks, and sometimes it's an immediate influence, and in most organizations that's what you think about, but over time, these are the people with the big ideas that make the big changes, okay? And they frequently don't have any impact or have marginal impact in the short term, big impact in the long term. People who think came up with the ideas behind computers, people who come up with the ideas behind the internet, and their ideas have impact, not necessarily them as individuals. The third type of person you find in large human organizations is an analyst. And this is something that's very important to learn, how to evaluate the pros and cons of alternative courses of actions and actually recommending what you think is the most desirable, the most appropriate course. This is one of the purposes of getting an education, and people who are trained as analysts or to be analytic respect other people who are analysts and enjoy the debate about the issues and enjoy thinking through these analytical questions. So it's intellectually challenging, it's desirable, it's interesting, it's important. It is not the same thing as getting anything done. And there's a lot of confusion, particularly among bright, well-trained people, between doing the analysis and getting the outcome. And frequently there's a big gap. Now, most of the people I've mentioned, these types of people who fit into these, albeit arbitrary categories, work alone or work in small groups. But to get things done in big organizations, you have to get people to work together. And the question is, how do you do that? And the answer is, most people in large organizations are overseen by administrators. Administrators provide oversight, which is defined in the Schaefer world as watching other people work. Okay? Most members of middle management are administrators, and an awful lot of members of top management are administrators. Notice I didn't say adding any value. I said watching other people work. Now, I was well trained in the administrative skills when I went to the Department of Mental Health in Illinois. I initially joined at a middle management job, and because of some success we had, I was promoted to be the deputy director in charge of management. We had 22 hospitals, I think 26,000 inpatients. It was the biggest department in the state. This was years ago, but departments of mental health are still very large because the federal government doesn't do much in mental health. It's mostly left up to states. And I bumped into a guy who'd been around for a very long time. He said, look, you don't want to get too active here. What you got to understand is the department is like a big stovetop. And there are basically 26 pots. Note my audio-visual thing. There are 26 pots. What you want to do is kind of watch those pots. And if anything boils over, you want to turn down the flame. Okay? That's what administrators do. They watch other people work, and if something goes wrong enough to be obvious, they intervene in some way. Okay? And that's the definition of most people in management jobs in most large organizations. So what do real managers do? Well, real managers are rare, and they are people who change the physical reality of how an organization operates to achieve a pre-established goal. Okay? Things are different because a manager has been involved. Okay? The guy who set up the original assembly line was a manager. Okay? That's different from them doing it all the same. So managers change the physical reality of how things happen in order to achieve a planned result. Okay? They develop strategies to achieve goals, and they monitor the process of implementing them through plans and budgets. Not fun, not popular, not easy. Very important. Managers tell people what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. Okay? They don't watch, they instruct. Now, interesting side note is that the organization operates. What actually happens in an organization, how the individual contributors and others behave, is a function of the values that are displayed by the manager's behaviors. In other words, even though they're giving orders, even though they have budget and they have plans, okay, it isn't what they say that results in how people behave, but it's how they behave. And if they behave in a way that says, I take these plans seriously, and I know the difference between selling 100 bars of soap and 50 bars of soap, and there'll be consequences, then people will actually behave in a similar way, and magically you'll sell 100 bars of soap, not 50. Managers who don't have that kind of integrity, managers who don't have the rigor that's necessary to make all this work, end up not getting good results. So managers are people with an attention to detail. They're very rigorous, and they confront poor performers. Okay, this is not easy. This is not popular. Okay, and it's not. You don't see it all that frequently. Now, leaders play a very different role and have very different attributes, and good managers are not necessarily good leaders. And in fact, in most cases, good managers are bad leaders, okay? Or just the traits that make them successful as managers. Leaders are people who have a vision of the future that's so compelling and it's communicated so persuasively that other people take action to achieve that vision, okay? Very different from managing. Leaders have a vision of the future that results in other people doing something. Okay? Very rare. Okay? Very important. They articulate their vision of the future. Okay? They tell people what it looks like. Okay? They define the mission of the organization. They say, we're here to achieve this future state. And parenthetically, the future state is always over the horizon. You never get there. Okay? It's always out there, right? They establish clear, time-specific, quantifiable goals, and we'll talk about one in just a few minutes, and they inspire other people to achieve those goals. But they don't tell them what to do or how to do it, and most of the time, they don't know what to do or how to do it. Okay? That's why they make such lousy managers. Okay? Right? Now, successful leaders carefully communicate their vision and provide specific guidance as to who is responsible. Big problem in labor-intensive organizations. You got to delegate appropriately or people bump into each other. You have to get people aligned. Okay? They tell people what they're supposed to achieve, but usually let them figure out how to do it. You've heard the phrase, hands-on leadership. That's not leadership, that's management. Okay? Leaders are necessary, not to manage. Leaders are necessary only when it's too big to manage. Okay? And so you get a lot of people who have leadership traits who screw up small organizations. Okay? Because you don't need leaders if it's small enough to manage. You certainly don't need leaders if an individual contributor can do it. Okay? So good leaders are not necessarily good managers. Good managers are not necessarily good leaders, and usually they're both bad at the other thing. I want to make a minor digression, and that is one of the attributes of leaders has to do with authenticity. There's a huge difference between being in charge and being a leader. And one of the big differences is the people who watch the behavior of a leader believe in the authenticity of that person. Okay? That person is always confident in their own decisions as opposed to being always right. Okay? So I can invest in this person. He or she knows where they're going. Also, that person believes in the importance and the value of the enterprise. This is worth doing. Okay? There are lots of things I can do with my time. This one is worth doing, okay? Because that person believes it's worth doing, and his or her time is being invested. And they focus, leaders, on results, not the process. Managers focus on process, how we're going to do it. Leaders are talking about the results, okay? And they're always moving the goal. Well, there's another level of leadership that's rare, but exceptionally impactful and very important in human history, and that's symbolic leaders. Now, symbolic leaders inspire and motivate others not by giving specific orders, but by embodying certain traits or calling for a desired state that they represent. They are almost the physical embodiment of what they hope to achieve. And they're necessary, not just when it's big, but when the challenge is so overwhelming that most people don't have any hope, or when the solution is too complicated to articulate. We're going to look at some examples of leaders and symbolic leaders in a minute, but I want to discuss some of the challenges that they face first. There are very different challenges in the public sector and in the private sector, and I think the growing interconnectedness of our world has created even greater challenges in terms of leading global change. So we're going to break this out and quickly go through the differences. The operation of public and private sector organizations can require both leadership and management, but different challenges require different styles and different management behaviors. And in my experience, the public sector presents a couple of very unique challenges. The first is that it was set up in this country not to work. Okay? Our government was set up with 3 branches, and the notion was that it's supposed to be very difficult to get anything done. That's what the founders had in mind, and by God, they succeeded. It is very difficult to get anything done in our system of government. Jack and I were talking earlier about the British system. In the parliamentary system, if you have a majority, you just jam it down everybody else's throat. You won. That's it. We're ready to go. Okay? That's not how our system works. Okay? You've got 3 distinct branches of government, and they operate independently, and sometimes, in a very uncoordinated way. Also in government, it's very difficult to establish new behaviors because most of these institutions have been around for a long time, and they have the problem I mentioned before, which is this is how we do it. Okay, just because the outside world has changed, or worse yet, just because we have a new president doesn't mean that this department of the federal government is going to change. You have the same thing at the state level. Also, we have lots of great pieces of legislation that tell our government employees what they're supposed to do, but rarely do we legislate specific goals and metrics. Okay? So it's very hard to know whether you're actually doing what the law says, and that's why our court system is so active. And the need for communication and clarity is critical, and in most government institutions it's very hard to do that. This is a very busy slide, and this has to do with some of my experience in the private sector, and you'll see I've actually got a footnote here. This is an article I wrote that was in the Harvard Business Review. But basically the story here is that over a almost 19 or 20-year period, there were 5 different periods of time in the history of our company that required very different leadership and management techniques. And the first was when I arrived in 1986, I discovered that the company was insolvent. Thank you very much, board of directors. I appreciate that. And I was just too dumb to leave. So we had a period of time where we were talking about economic survival. During that period of time, I call it here Autocratic Leadership. This was tops down, and it was basically management. You do what I say, you do it now, or you get out of here. And that was not fun, but we actually turned the company around. Next period of time had to do with growth and profitability. We were the worst performing blue plan in America in 1986. We were the best performing blue plan in 1989. Thank you very much. You're a hero. Turns out we're not competing with any blue plans. Right? That's absolutely the wrong comparison. We're competing with for-profit health plans. This was the beginning of the HMO revolution here in California, and we're getting our rear ends handed to us. So we got to grow. We got to become profitable. This is a period of time we call participative leadership, and this is a period where you can no longer give orders because the thing is now a little bit too big, and you have to trust local management and get results through people and expect them to add value. Well, that worked out very well. You heard some of the things Jack mentioned, and we ended up growing very dramatically and being very profitable. So the issue was that I felt we had to change the nature of health insurance in America. A small goal, but got to have a vision. And the focus was on changing the healthcare financing system, and to do that you have to create more leaders and expect them to surprise you. Very different than obviously the first or even the second period. The fourth period had to do with my conclusion that we had to challenge the way we did things, because they might have been successful in the 80s, but this was now a new century, and we really had to change things. And we also had to align both business and social objectives. And then finally, we became the biggest. And parenthetically, when USC gets to be #1 on the list, that's a bad place to be, boy. When you are the biggest, everybody's out to get you. Everybody criticizes you. There are no secrets. Okay, you are in everybody's target. You become everybody's target. So that required a very different kind of leadership. Anyhow, you can read the article if you want to. Perhaps more helpful would be this chart, which is a comparison of leading change in public and private institutions in my experience. And the point is that communication thing I talked about earlier is absolutely critical in both areas. The shared values in these organizations are very different. Government is people in government are generally behavior modified into being risk averse. Hey, you don't get any credit for doing things right. But if there's a screw up, in Cleveland, that means that some congressman's going to be pissed off, and you can't let that happen. So most people in government are focused on staying out of the newspaper and not getting in trouble, as opposed to making change. And change results in people being unhappy. So it's a very risk-averse, in general, environment. In the private sector, it varies. I've been involved in companies who are very risk-averse, that were even more hidebound than government. But some companies are different, and it is easier in the private sector to change those shared values. There's very low agreement on the value of change in government, because change involves risk. Risk is problematical, and you can get in trouble. In most private sector organizations I've been in, everybody agrees on that change is appropriate. We've got to get a new product out. We've got to be involved in a new geography. We've got to change the color of something. But they're very worried about doing it well and having it work. Okay, this is another. Take a minute out. In any of these situations, if you got to make a decision, there are always three things you can do. The first thing is you can say, yes, let's do that. Okay, that is the least desirable, because that's the most risky. You made a change. If it doesn't work, you're in trouble. So the second option is to say no. No, we're not going to do that, which is much safer. You're not going to have the problem of having it fail, but you said no. And somebody can always say, if we did that, things would be better. So the best option is always to do nothing. That's what happens here. A lot of analysis and a lot of doing nothing. In the public world, accountability is very complex, very confusing. To who are you accountable? Are you accountable to the people? Are you accountable to the head of your department? Are you accountable to the president? Are you accountable to the legislature? And so you're sort of not accountable to anybody. It's a great deal in that regard. In the private sector, most accountability is financial and very narrow, and so you can in theory do the right thing. Earnings per share are up, that and a dime, as they say. So the problem is that when we step back and we compare leading change in an organization with a set of customers and products, or an agency with a specific set of legal responsibilities, it's very different from addressing these kinds of issues. And what Dean Knott asked me to do, and the reason we're here, is to apply some of these observations about leadership and management to what do you do about these global challenges. These things are overwhelming, okay? And I don't want to depress people here, but I think we're living in dangerous times. Or as I think Shakespeare said, the times are out of joint. Our economy is not doing well, and don't believe it's coming back all at once or fast. And our cumulative debt, $15 trillion, is an extremely difficult problem to deal with, that even if the economy turns around, we will not have addressed that. Europe is in bigger trouble than we are economically. These Arab Spring changes, halfway around the world are very exciting, but it's kind of doubtful to believe that every one of those situations is going to result in something that is better in the short term, at least for us. Okay? The global economy can be disrupted. There are issues in China and Russia that are pretty scary. There are all kinds of human rights and healthcare issues, and we've learned recently what natural disasters can do to the global economy. So when you look at global challenges and you go back to some of the thoughts about leadership and management, what do you see? Well, first, the problems are extremely complex, and they literally are overwhelming. I mean, we could sit here all day. I don't think we'd come up with solutions to all these problems. I don't think, this is me personally, that we have a lot of leaders who are responding. What we seem to have is a lot of bright people who are either analysts or managers, who are analyzing the problems and on a one-by-one basis trying to find solutions. And when you have big problems, that's what you do. You break them into small pieces and you solve them one by one. But problems of the magnitude that were on the previous slide and the complexity, okay, I don't think there's time to do it one by one. I don't think we have 20 years to deal with the cumulative deficit of this country. I don't know, we have 5. I mean, I don't know, but I'm at the podium, so I'll tell you, we don't. Okay? This single issue focus, which makes sense if you're an analyst, okay, results in trying to solve one problem at a time instead of trying to reset or reinvent the situation and pursuing a vision, okay, that, and this may be a difficult word to introduce now, but that simplifies, okay, and that inspires and that aligns people to get to that desired future state. I think what's needed are leaders, not managers, not analysts, and not because they're not important. They are very important, not because we have enough of them, we don't. But on the global or even the national stage, this isn't about analyzing or managing our way out of it. This is about inspiring other people. The complexity of our problems requires extraordinary global leadership. And as I said, we have analysts and managers leading nations instead of leaders or public leaders, or instead of leaders or symbolic leaders. Now, have we had them before? And this is where I risk everybody jumping out of their seat. Let me go back to the 20th century, long ago, and talk about a leader, and particularly talk about some of the traits that I described, okay? This is John Kennedy. We choose to go to the moon in this decade. We? No. John Kennedy chose to go to the moon. Why? Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win. Now, do you think John F. Kennedy knew how to get to the moon? This guy was a lawyer and a career politician. I don't think he knew beans about getting to the moon. Okay? He wasn't talking about how to do it. He wasn't talking about the complexities and the issues. Okay? He set this incredible vision, of the future. I don't think, parenthetically, he was even interested in the day-to-day operations. If you recall, he turned this over to Lyndon Johnson, another guy who knew nothing about this. But the point is, he had a clear and elevating goal, and he described it in terms of his vision of what this country was about. He didn't say this is good for science. He didn't say this is good militarily. Okay? He put this in his vision of what America is all about, and it was inspirational. NASA, the agency that actually did it, one of the greatest government institutions ever in terms of getting things done and solving unbelievably difficult problems, and it happened. Okay? I don't know what the odds were when he made this, but they weren't real good. If you go back to World War II, you see the emergence of a special kind of leader, the kind that emerges very infrequently, and one who personifies the vision and has a profound effect. This is the beginning of World War II. This is after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Okay. This guy who had polio, who couldn't stand up, says this great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Now, I don't really know what that means, quite frankly. I don't know that anybody knows what it means, but he was not afraid. Okay. He personified this country and his vision of what it was all about. One guy. Okay, he embodied confidence in the future, and Americans bought into it. Now, there was some reason to think that he might have been right, but he had a peer across the ocean who had a much greater reason to fear the future. Okay? When it was clear that the Germans were better trained and better equipped than anybody else in Europe or the Great Britain, and they were actually rolling over Europe, Churchill said and made his countrymen believe the following, okay? We shall not flag or fail. We will fight on the beaches. We'll fight on the landing grounds. We'll fight in the fields and the streets. We shall never surrender. Okay? So Churchill was the British Lion. He personified, okay, what he felt England was up to and was all about. Now, I urge you, if you have any interest in history at all, if you're in London, go to a museum called the Cabinet War Rooms. Because I always assumed that he was making these speeches standing on Buckingham Palace, Okay? He was in a basement. Okay? He was in an area that was held up by 2x4s. They ran the war on a Michelin tire map, the kind of thing you bought at a gas station. Okay? This was amateur night square. These guys had no right to be in this war, let alone win it. Okay? And this guy just wasn't going to let that happen. All right? Now, these are extraordinary men, all three of them. I think this guy is the most extraordinary, at least in recent history. Maybe he was crazy, I don't know, but he was a symbolic leader. He symbolized that country to itself and its vision, of the future. The problem with leadership, however, is that it is substance-free. You don't always have to have great goals. This is another great leader, okay? I intend to set up a 1,000-year Reich, and anyone who supports me in this battle is a fellow fighter for a unique spiritual, I would say divine creation. And he motivated his country, and they all bought in. 1,000-year Reich, over the horizon, where we're going. We will dominate the world. So there's nothing inherently good about leadership, not at all. So what's the big finish? Well, I think organizations and nations require leaders. This is large organizations and nations require leaders who know where they want to go, who have a compelling vision, who convince us to take the trip with them. We are so invested or compelled or inspired by their view of the future that we want to go along with it. That where they want to go benefits from environmental change. It is consistent with what's going on in the world, and that these people have to be authentic in their leadership and have to be consistent. Now, well, we can talk about consistency because some of these guys, if you know your history well, have kind of gone like that, and some of these ladies as well. But their vision has remained constant, and they tend to move in that direction. You got to know when to tack as well as to go straight ahead. So, unfortunately, in my opinion, We have analysts and managers today addressing domestic and international challenges as they arise, and the result is that inconsistent worldview and lack of vision confuses and disappoints the public, okay? I bet there's a very good reason why we're in Libya and not in Syria, but I don't know what it is, okay? I'm sure there was, well, I'm not so sure, but I think there was a very good reason for going to Afghanistan, but I'm not sure I know what it is, and I'm not sure I know how it connects with what this country is supposed to be. Are we the world's policemen? Okay. And if so, is this legitimate police intervention, or are we something else? Is indeed the world changing? Well, if you look at what's going on in the economies of the developed world, it's changing dramatically. So you would think that some notion of who we are and what we're doing ought to change. Okay? All righty. So these folks don't resolve the challenges. That behavior can't resolve challenges in a complex and a rapidly changing world. Now, we may have few naturally occurring leaders, and I think you can make the case that crises lead to the emergence of leaders. Maybe leaders don't just emerge whenever we want them to. But it seems to me that citizens can and should demand that elected officials articulate a vision and act consistently to achieve that vision. And I don't think we've been doing a real good job of that in our country of late, either in terms of the leaders we have elected or how citizens have gone about electing those leaders. And that concludes the paid political announcement. Anybody have any comments they'd like to make about any of this? And anyone who starts with, on what basis do you make these assertions, don't start, okay? But assert whatever you would like to assert. Yes?
I just wonder how we decide what's an appropriate target for the leaders, or how they decide. So there are probably a lot of instances of someone saying, let's go to Mars, for example. We don't hear about those failures because it's such an unrealistic goal. When you mentioned the issue of what was the probability of success, there's a good chance Kennedy would have failed in that mission and we wouldn't have put him up here today. Similarly, the Allies had lost. So I just wonder, how do you think the leaders get the information to figure out what's a vision, but also what's reasonable to achieve?
Well, I think, successful leaders read the changing environment and have visions and strategies that take advantage of that changing environment. So there's a good bit of reactivity in it, as opposed to just kind of naked aggression. But the other point you mentioned is very important. We only know about the successful leaders. There are an awful lot of people who hope to be leaders and fail, either because the vision is wrong or they don't stimulate the behavior in others. But that's the key thing that leaders do. They stimulate other people to take action. And my favorite example of this is, I was working in government in the Democratic administration. I came back when Ronald Reagan was president and went to talk to some of the people that I had worked with. And I met this guy I'd never met before in the bowels of HEW, working on a program that isn't worth going into. And he was just killing himself, and it was just crazy stuff. I asked him what he thought he was doing, and he said, well, I'm a part of the Reagan Revolution. This is what the president wants. Well, nothing personal. Ronald Reagan, I don't think he even knew there was an HEW, let alone that this guy was in the basement. And I think Reagan was a leader. I think he qualifies, and in some ways a symbolic leader. But this guy was killing himself. Secure in what I consider the delusion, he considered the motivation that this is what the president wanted. And that's what you need to do. You need to be able to inspire others. And it doesn't come often. Yes?
I think you should make a list of leaders or symbolic or major leaders where it doesn't go down. Hitler is too incendiary an example, and I can't think of any at the moment. It's not my thing, but I think that would be helpful.
Sure.
And I think they could be very good leaders and fail, and that wouldn't be a terrible insult to them or to The second point is, the one person I thought of who started with Martin Luther King. And I was surprised that in fact all the leaders you had were in fact governmental leaders.
We're what? I'm sorry?
Governmental leaders.
Well, they're also, yeah, okay.
Symbolic leaders.
They're also far away. The closer you get in real time, but you're right. No, I would say that Martin Luther King was a great symbolic leader. I would agree.
Yeah, I mean, what I think, and Lincoln, of course, going back to the 19th century.
Right.
But I think that's the other point, that there are leaders who don't lead organizations per se,
Right.
societies.
Right.
And that would be helpful in sort of giving a substance to your claims.
Right.
The third, a little point, don't worry about the literature or scholarship. It is not impressive, to say the least. The 17 traits and,
Okay.
or the leadership programs,
Right.
I think that in fact, the way you present it is terrific in the following sense. I've seen this, here's my observations,
Right.
that's all.
Right.
Almost everybody says, I've seen this, here's my observation, and here's the method.
Yeah.
The punchline, they write a book.
Yeah.
Compulsive, obsessive compulsive. And I think that that's, for what you're trying to do, experience is very important. Then, other people get in trouble. Say, oh, this is that. But at least it's not grounded in, how to say, unfounded generalization and highfalutin theorizing.
Well, I could get highfalutin if you guys want me to, but there are lots of failed leaders in business. I mean, that's the easiest place to look at. In the political world, yeah, well, I guess we could do that as well. And certainly other parts of, that's a good idea. I will do that. Other comments? Yes, sir.
Yes, in response to this question about Kennedy and the launch program, although the general public is totally unaware of research is already done, and missiles that have already been designed and built, Kennedy had knowledge of those missiles, and those missiles already had the capability of getting there. My daughter was involved in building some of them. My uncle was in charge of the science program. He was not speaking in terms of unknowns. Something known by the people on the inside, what they could do and what they already had.
My point, maybe I didn't make it clear, was that he didn't know how to build a rocket or
Everything already
yeah.
been designed.
Right, and I mean, he's a smart guy. Nobody on the national, well, not nobody. One would hope that people on the national stage are not going to, make up things from whole cloth. But the point I was trying to make is that he was not a manager, and he was not going to make this happen. This was a goal that he saw in the context of his vision for this country. But yeah, obviously there were lots of people, both military and civilians, who were adding value and knew what they were doing, and that was the basis for, I think, setting that goal.
We got some
Yeah. Sure. Sorry. Yes.
Thank you very much. Very interesting point that you made, the difference between managers and leaders, that really always we are mixing. The question that I have is that one, that what do you think the specification of leaders before, the need that we have compared to today? I think that situation that they had, before leaders, they had to be some people that they cannot lead right now, based on the change that we have in the society. I think, yeah, charisma, I understand. People, they need to believe them, to follow them. But I think they need more openness in leaders that we don't have in our culture. Before leaders, they were saying their word and everybody followed them. I think leaders today, they cannot do it. They need to have more vision and they need to have more openness. I don't know how, but I think right now leadership is harder than.
Yeah, if we're talking about global or national leadership, I think it's much more difficult, and the reason is there aren't any secrets. I mean, everything is on YouTube or television or on the internet someplace, and everything is interconnected. it's very difficult to have come up with a vision that is sort of all encompassing, but that's literally what we need. When you look at human organizations, one way of thinking about that is you want to align the activities of the people in the organization. Because what happens in most organizations, people bump into each other or frequently are going in opposite directions. So what you want to do is align people so they're all moving in the same direction, and that it is the right direction. It's the direction that you want to go to. What the internet and the media have done, and not purposefully, is it sort of splintered the populace. So different things are very important to different people, but there's a lot of information about all of those things, and so people are just go in different directions. My kids don't read the newspaper anymore, and I'm sure there are people here who don't read the newspaper because they get this custom-made thing on their laptop or their iPad now that gives them the information, the news about those things they care about. So you'll be happy to know my son knows everything there is to know about snowboarding. Okay? And nothing about what's happening in Greece because he doesn't really care about that. And my daughter, my daughter's a USC graduate, so of course she's much more cosmopolitan. But I think there's much greater transparency. There's much more information floating around, but it's very hard to bring that together. And I think we're in terms of public policy and public discourse, we're kind of overwhelmed. And you can, if you're worried about something, you can choose on the internet to find a million reasons to be worried, or if you're happy about something, you can choose to find a million reasons to be happy. The question is, where should we all be going? Okay, and what are the things that are really important we ought to be worried about, and what's the stuff that we ought to be pleased about? And that the ability to do that takes more than analysis. I mean, an analyst can come to a conclusion, but the point I was trying to make is coming to a conclusion is different than getting things done and motivating other people. That's very difficult.
We're going to
yes?
take one more question.
Okay. All right.
I just wanted to ask you, Leonard, do you think charisma plays a really crucial role in leadership? And the reason I'm asking this is that there's a leader that I'm thinking of, in fact, a few of them, that I might disagree with them totally, but once they have put an argument to me, I'm suddenly in agreement and I follow them anywhere. And I don't think of myself as weak or not able to demonstrate what my thinking is, but I think that there's an element there that is different than somebody else stating the same thing to you and you believing in them. So do you think there are people like that?
Yeah, part of my definition here, I want to make sure I go back, is that it isn't, parenthetically, I don't think you can train leaders. I think leaders have it or they don't. You can train people in leadership techniques, okay, but that's different than being a leader. That's being in charge and hopefully doing a good job. But I want to make sure I find the right word. Okay, all right. So leaders have a vision of the future that is so compelling and communicated so persuasively. That's the charisma thing. Now, I think there's different kind of charisma. When I talk about healthcare, one of the things I talk about is most healthcare is built around individual contributors, and it's mom and pop practices, 1 or 2 doctors, 3 or 4 doctors. There are, oddly enough, in California, many, but across the country, few integrated multi-specialty group practices. And to run an integrated practice of strong, well-educated individual practitioners who don't care about the whole, they care about what they're doing. I'm doing God's work, I'm saving patients. You need what I call charismatic physician leaders. Now, the issue there is, for lay people, they don't look charismatic at all. Okay? But they're charismatic when they deal with the fellow physicians. Okay? So they're different. The point I'm trying to make is there are different kinds of charisma, and I don't know if charisma is the right word. It's that ability to have a vision and communicate it persuasively and compellingly, so somebody does something about it. Okay? And I think acting skills are probably very helpful. I saw Ronald Reagan give a presentation where, just by odd luck, I happened to be sitting on a dais directly behind him. And so I could see the speech that came up on those, those things. And the difference between what the speech said and how he gave that speech was night and day. I mean, he was just terrific. But he also was authentic. He believed in an America that I don't know if it ever was, but he certainly believed it. And he was relatively, he went around, but he was relatively consistent, certainly in his beliefs, and he inspired others to follow. So I think maybe acting skills and having charisma is important, but it's about the vision, and it's about how authentic and how persuasive you are around that vision. And different people, different environments define charisma differently. I'd be very interested, for instance, off the record, to learn how faculty members here view the last 3 presidents USC has had. Okay, were they charismatic? Were they leaders? I have my own point of view, but I want to continue to be welcome here, so I'm going to keep it to myself. Thank you all very much.